Welcome back to Great Karate Myths Debunking the Legends. Today we're diving into one of the most persistent and perhaps misunderstood elements of karate, the concept of blocking. We'll be exploring how this idea has evolved, what it might have originally meant, and how it affects the way we train and teach today. Nathan, you're going to start us off by laying out the case as presented in the Great Karate Myth.
Well, okay, that's fine. I won't attempt to give the whole case because I'll, as Robert W. Smith put it, I'll be like the man who tried to spell banana and didn't know when to stop. So I'll start with one point just as a question, so I've got three questions basically, but they meld into one. I'll start with this. When attempting to use a so-called traditional block, which traditionally consists of two parts, a preparation. For instance, in a downward block, the fist comes up next to the ear on the opposite side, and the forearm sweeps down, and to perform the so-called lower block, the Giren-barai. Similarly, there are middle-level blocks and an upper level, and in, for instance, the Tenno Kata that we discussed in the last podcast, there are 6 basic blocks. All of them comprise of 2 parts, but Funakoshi Sensei Jishin said that the two parts should be performed as one. Fine. So if you can learn to do that, great. Here's the first question: how do you know what the target is? How do you know exactly what's coming in your direction? Whether it's a high punch, a low punch, how do you know a kick? How are you? So this, that's a partly rhetorical question, because I asked this many years ago. I asked this 40-something years ago of a senior black belt who said, you just would, it's just experience. And I thought, okay, I'll buy that for now. But I still have never met anyone that could actually do it. And just to kind of develop that just marginally, if you look at the way the blocks are usually demonstrated, they're done in a very ritualistic way, usually against a front punch, a stepping punch called oizuki, which is either a chasing punch, or a junzuki, which is the same hand and same leg are forward. How do you know what's coming in your direction? And I just add one more thing. Particularly as frequently in real violence, the person who's assaulting you isn't exactly sure what they're doing. They just want to attack you, and if you've got any hair, they want to tear some out and examine the roots, as I once wrote. Over to you, Shamir.
Tom, can you help us understand how the concept of blocking might have been interpreted differently in the original Chinese or Okinawan context?
Well, yeah, there weren't any blocks. The only way you do find the blocks is on the stage and screen. And I know it's a subject that we've touched on already, but I think that just how widespread martial arts were in terms of theatrical martial arts in China shouldn't be underestimated, because there's vast theatrical traditions, and stage combat and stage/ritual combat was very, very commonplace. And people would travel to go and see different performances, and there was lots of elements to these stage performances. So that the choreography that we've kind of inherited in karate probably has its roots in the theater, and that's where it belongs, really. And the antique, in terms of the antique kata that were used, that were martial skills, there aren't any blocks. So because they're all going first, and so there's no, the idea of someone attacks and then there's a defense. It doesn't exist in the antique kata at all. It's you can find it in the stage and screen, and in modern recreational martial arts, which are quite detached from real fighting, and even full contact. You don't, even where the conditions are set and there's rules and things like that. There's no blocks being performed there. There's covers and there's guards and there's attempts to exchange in the melee, but apart from that, there isn't any. There's no age uke or gedambarai performed in the UFC. I'm sure someone will find a clip somewhere in the thousands of hours of footage that kind of looks like a gedambarai, but that might be more chance than and luck than intentional. Yeah.
Tom's completely right there. That we're looking at the basis in the sort of block and counter attack. In the main, as Tom said quite correctly, from the, Chinese theatrical performances. But there's another element, which a point I'd like to clarify, that, and we've spoken about this before, that where Tom says, the antique kata are about going first. Let's just remind everyone, and I'll qualify that there's proactive and reactive, or as my old doctor used to say, you can either do something or you can do nothing. You're going first. So the original arts, the antique kata, were generally proactive. However, what the demands, current modern demands made of these antique kata, is that they are somehow capable of providing the practitioner with a reactive defense, because that's what's required of them, and that's what people have come to believe that they are or should be, and that's not accurate. They're quite the opposite. So Tom is quite right. They're about going first. They are about controlling the situation. They are about being proactive and not reactive. Okay. Another point is, apart from the difficulty in working out what the likely target's going to be. An interesting. I wrote in the myth. I wrote that in observing an internationally extremely well known and very eminent, prominent practitioner of Goju-ryu karate, he gave a series of demonstrations which he was well known for. A lot of them came from a series of films that he published. And on examination, if we look at 74 techniques, I think it's 74. No, sorry, 77. If my memory serves me, of 77 demonstrated techniques that were being portrayed as bunkai or carelessly translated as applications or investigations. They're generally explanations. This is how you use the kata, or how you may use the kata. But these were presented 74 different techniques, all drawn from the kata. Of the 74, 77, 55 of them were against a straight punch, a stepping punch. And then I think it was around about 11 were against a straight front kick. There are several, I think there are about 10 or so clothing grips. I think there was one wrist grip, if memory's not serving me fully here. But we're getting close to that 77. There's probably a couple missing. The point being, 55 defenses against essentially a straight stepping punch, in which the opponent pretty much steps and leaves the punching arm in situ, in place. I think there were one or two where he appears to throw a second punch. The problem is, how are you going to know that? If you remove that stepping punch from the equation, then do we still have uses for those 55 defenses? Which leads me to a third question. And it's rhetorical, but you can, everyone should be free to supply their own answer. How many defenses do you need against a middle-level straight stepping punch? It's, I invite everyone to form, to come up with their own answer to that question. I made a suggestion in the myth. So these applications cannot be demonstrated without choreography, without determining the target. And quite often, certainly when I was growing up and learning karate, the target used to be called. It's usually one of two: Jodan, upper level, or Judan, middle level. And so the target was called out, Judan, and the defender knew what was coming. Jodan, and the same. Of course, when that got to sparring, the whole thing completely broke down, and nobody could deal very well with the snap punches, especially those speedy back fists that, for instance, the Goju-ryu style was just so good at in the 1970s and 80s. They were fast, and there was no way one was ever going to apply quotes traditional blocks against those chaps when they unloaded those back fists. And it's the same for the Shukokai. They were light and fast, and their reverse punch was just so quick. Same problem. I'll rest my case there temporarily. Otherwise, I'll overdevelop the theme. Anyone would like?
Yes. So the counter argument has been that the kata are not for sparring. The counter argument is the kata is that defensive block is for your opponent who doesn't know karate.
We're back into that old myth of the untrained person again, aren't we? That somehow the fact that they don't know what a block is or a karate punch is makes them in some way more vulnerable to someone's defensive karate skills, which is bullshit, really, isn't it?
And of course, in a self-defense situation, it's too fast and no one stands at the correct distance and throws a straight punch. It's usually storming in, throwing some sort of scruffy hook or something like that. And the person actually tries to move out of the way. They're not going to stand there and try and do a block.
Yeah.
They're going to get out of the way if they can. So,
yeah, indeed. You also the in the so-called traditional training, the attack always starts outside of the range. They're not even in the correct distance, because they're actually the stepping punch commence from a weapon's distance. So that gives both the time and the space for the defender to prepare and to withdraw or even perhaps even advance accordingly. So there's enough time and distance for the so-called traditional movements to occur. But of course, if the person's already in exchanging range, punching range, then there's no chance of that happening, which is why it doesn't, and it can't. It simply it can't work like that. There is if I could just press on a little bit there. We are going back to what everyone was thinking in the 80s and 90s. There have been lots of different thinking that sprung up, certainly since the 90s. And we were around when people were starting to say, well, these blocks are nerve point strikes as well. And they're in two parts. And the first part disables the incoming limb, and the second part deflects, the person's force away. And, again, none of that could be demonstrated in sparring or in mixed martial arts, which some of us had. We knew that was going to be arriving on the scene because it was the logical place to go. We'd all done our own training with foul belts, gum shields, head guards, and various types of weights of gloves. We'd done that years ago. The point I'm making is that we are pursuing at the moment the ultra old-fashioned idea that the movements that are blocks. A lot of new thinking is that they're not. And in some respects, we made significant contributions to that thinking within our group. But we didn't come up with a conclusion that they were in any way unarmed ballistic movements. We now know that there is a degree of kinetic force employed, but as we've discussed at considerable length, but it's generally involving a weapon. If you're not using one, you're controlling one. And I think that yes, Tom's absolutely right. There were and are no blocks in the antique kata, none whatsoever, not a single block.
I can remember when I trained in Goju-ryu, they were teaching Tensho, or Rokushu, as we call it, as blocking techniques. They were trying to apply those the wrist upwards as a block, and it's like, no, you're just going to bust your wrist. I'm not joking. And these were people who should have known better because they were big guys. I mean, one of them was a rugby player in his spare time. He'd had loads of fights, so you ought to have known, really.
Yeah, I've seen recent interpretations since sort of we opened the sort of Pandora's box, perhaps. There's recent interpretations of blocking being suggested they're there for grabbing and striking.
Yeah. I mean, if that was the case, are they really good representations of grabbing? Is that the best someone could come up with for a grab? Is a Jodanuke or a Gedan Barai? Is that the best, way? It's nonsense. It's kind of grasping at straws because they don't know what the movements do. And so it's kind of finding something that loosely fits. That'll do, And actually, there's more to them. They do serve a really good function when there is something for them rather than just, well, they don't quite work as blocks. We can kind of do them as grabs or something like that. It's nonsense. But there aren't blocks in getting rid of that idea. Those movements, what are they for? And so that's why you have to go after the original functions. That's why you've got to try and understand what the whole form does. You can't just pull out. It's breaking down of isolating techniques and saying that one's this and one's that or something like that. It's just not a useful way of approaching. You've got to be able to look at the whole form and does it fit within the whole form? If you take a movement from an anti-kata and say that's a block, you've got to be able to answer, why is that block there at that point in the form? What comes before it? What comes after it? What's happening at and all of those kinds of questions, which is part of, looking at a kata.
Yes, indeed. That thinking that you can just pick out looks like the middle of the cap. And I is born from the mistaken view that these kata are some kind of formal solo choreographed sort of shadow boxing routine. Somehow logically covers all the possible basics of ways you could be struck or grabbed or pushed or pulled. And as Tom so eloquently described and explained in a previous podcast, how do you catalogue that? I remember him saying, go ahead, make a kata. How would you go about it? Where would you begin? How where? Well, the person goes to hit me. Most people are right hand. Or maybe the first thing I should practice in my homemade kata is some sort of upper block against a right-handed punch. Nonsense. What about if there's a left-footed toe punch kick to your knee? Or it's not a kick or a punch at all. How about if you're jumped on and bundled or headlocked or assaulted with a sort of hit with a sort of rugby type tackle. It's just, your kata creation would go out the window. Yeah, sorry, back to you, Tom.
I think that the distance is an interesting thing to explore as well, because in a lot of their choreographed bunkai, the distance is all very consistent, and no one's sort of taken by surprise or bundled. It's always very neatly and tidily done, as if it was for the stage or screen, Billy. But if you take it a kata like Goju-ryu, for example, which is, it's a tonfa form for use against a pole arm. The idea of it is that you do it on your terms. You're not engaging on the distance that would be needed to use a pole arm effectively. You're moving right within that range with the tonfa and engaging in very, very close quarters. And so there isn't going to be an exchange backwards and forwards. There's going to be a struggle, but the idea is to overwhelm. And you've got your map within the form, within the antique kata. And so it's a completely different type of thinking from anything that A does to B or something, and responds or reacts. And so that's what sets the antique kata apart from choreography, or applied bunkai against a straight stepping punch or something like that.
Absolutely. I think the other, so distance is absolutely a critical factor, as we've discussed here. But the another is quite important to take into consideration, which we have raised, which is a compound attack. So usually there's an attack and there's a block and a counter attack. Well, how do you stop simultaneous exchange? Even if you're grabbing and seizing an attacking arm, unless the attacker's only got one arm, which is possible, he's got 3 other limbs he can use. He could be following up. He could he could collapse a failed punch, shoulder barge, or a grappling anything into some primitive takedown, or even a sophisticated one. That the point being, how on earth are you supposed to know that? And unless you are correctly shutting the person down. And the other thing in terms of the awareness of distance is, I remember being in the monastery up at in West Sussex. It was a very interesting experience. The monks and nuns were incredibly serene. They were incredibly skillful. The shrine room was beautiful, with huge, great sort of, massive, great gilded Buddha at the front. Wonderful environment with a dais at the front around which it was a wonderful. And I remember the abbot. I remember, there was, the Sangha had chanted, so the Pali canon had been chanted, and the meditation was begun, and the environment was incredibly tranquil. And part of the ceiling, the meditation hall ceiling, fell, just collapsed. Just not a huge part. I think somebody had left some taps on upstairs, and it caused some damage, and something heavy had. So the ceiling fell, and I don't know. Perhaps I was a bit naive, but sort of Superman thinking, expected the senior monks to just sit blithely, sit absolutely still as the ceiling fell in on the head. And I wasn't sure how I felt, probably slightly disappointed, when as the ceiling began to go, they absolutely scarpered and disappeared, vanished really quickly. And I had to give that some thought, and of course it's realistic. They're not going to sit and in a serene way while the ceiling's falling in on them. And I think the analogy I'd like to make with that is between that is You can't expect meditation skills to aid a person survive a collapsing ceiling. And it's the thinking that says, well, you've got to be able to learn Naihanchin or Chinto or Pasai or Kusenku, and you've got to be able to use it in a pub brawl or a car park somewhere or a nightclub or goodness knows, and you've got to be able to be able to deal with several opponents at once. In other words, you've got to be Superman. As a monk, for instance, to go back to the story or the analogy, the monk should should have been able to predict the ceiling falling in, or B should have just sat still in the lotus position, but just simply dodged the different pieces as they fell. I mean, nonsense. They did the proper, sensible human thing and got out the way in case they got injured. Fortunately, nobody did get injured. But it's the same with our subject, with the karate kata. They're not they're not something that can solve all evils. They're purpose built for very specific arresting and both civil and militia arresting techniques. People. Let me just put this another way. Police officers get injured too. They break their legs and trip up, and we need to really ditch the Kata Superman syndrome. I think I've said enough for for a bit. I could go on, but
There's a really, really good Jim Carrey sketch which kind of sums up blocking really, and it's he's a karate instructor, and he invites someone up to demonstrate with him, and he gives them a knife, and he says, "Okay, stab me, go for me," and the participant says, "Oh, are you sure?" And he's like, "Yeah, don't worry, I'm a master." And they stab him right in the stomach, and he starts bleeding, and he goes, "No, you've done the attack wrong." And he hands the knife back, and he shows them how to do the attack with the knife, and they get it wrong again, so he gets stabbed a second time. And so he has to teach the right attack again just so he can get the block. And I think that sums up blocking than anything better than anything can talk about it. Yeah, so perhaps we can link the Jim Carrey sketch on YouTube for people to watch and enjoy. Yeah, that kind of encapsulates my view on it.
I was just thinking then about the Monty Python sketch with the banana, the self-defense against someone attacks you with a banana or something. He gets a gun out and shoots him.
knife sketch, Jim Carrey sketch. That's right. Two of those techniques from the 77 techniques from Kata that were being demonstrated. That's right. Two of them were against a knife attack, but both of those knife attacks used the same format, stepping punch format, except the person, was armed with a knife. So, to all intents and purposes, it was, the same format, straight punch and a full step, simply that the person had a knife. And it's not in any way the way, well, anyone that knows even a little tiny bit about knife fighting, and I don't claim to be an expert, but anyone that's observed it or had any training in it knows that is not how. For a start, they're all different types of knives, but even one that was just improvised, or a sharp object. What is it? It's just there are lots of different ways of using it, and the more capable and aggressive the person, they don't even need to be trained. They just need to be determined. And you're in a whole new, horrible world of risk and in fact, currently in the UK, our knife crime rates are like nothing I've ever observed not in this country, in my entire life, which is a sad fact of the reality going up against or any involvement with a weapon, with weapons.
That's an interesting point that you've just brought up there, where you've mentioned that that you've got these self-defense against a knife programs, but as you just said, the variable there is the size of the knife.
It doesn't even need to be a big knife. If it's sharp, it's going to cut you. And it's realizing how easily extreme damage can be done with even a dull blade. It doesn't take a lot to cause someone life-threatening injury, and that's a brutal reality of it. And it's not to be. I don't think it's to be approached lightly. Really, I think it's to be taken. And so when you start talking about blocking or intercepting someone that's trying to butcher you, or whatever, these are serious problems, but there might not be any good solutions, and that's a hard reality as well, and speaks to that perfectionism that Nathan mentioned, where someone blocks and counters, and then the duel is over, and the good guy, the karate or gal, the karateka's won, and the villain with the knife, has been incapacitated and all the rest of it. It's nonsense. And so, yeah, I think that's it's blocking there's nothing to do with that at all. What takes place in those sorts of crimes and that type of violence.
Yeah, I think I don't want to push the point too much, because I do want to move away from the knives, because I think we've almost done that justice. But just the sad reality is, if you've ever seen the result of that, and I have, in an operating theatre, if you see what, let's take a stab to the abdomen, that wreaks havoc with I'm sorry to be close, but the contents of the bowel end up where they shouldn't be, which pretty much leads to some horrendous, life-threatening sepsis. So it's incredibly serious, and modern surgery and modern medicine and skillful use of antibiotics and so on is fantastic and gets great results, but the experience is quite miserable and horribly life-threatening. I wouldn't, and it's not territory, that really karate should even be on. But this is because karate is expected to be a panacea for all evils, to use that phrase. And I go back to my ceiling falling in. Well, you must have a defense for the ceiling falling in. And yes, there is one. And the monks demonstrated it perfectly. Get out of the way. Don't be there when it falls. That's the reality. And if you are there when it falls, then I've got news for you. You get hit by falling plaster and masonry. That's real life. And no amount of. So that, I think, can return us quite nicely to the fantasy of blocking and thinking of blocking, and basically related to what we think it should be, what we think is possible, largely not from our experience, but from watching films or martial art demonstrations. And that can lead, particularly for people who don't train, to a belief that we know what it is or how it could or should work. And quite frankly, it's not necessarily the case. Okay, so we were discussing the myth of blocking. So that does actually come from the Great Karate Myth, and it's just a subheading in a chapter where the subject is covered. It's also quite useful to note that one doesn't find set blocking techniques in other combat. We don't find it in boxing, for example. We don't find it in Muay Thai. We don't find it in kickboxing. There were no set blocks. It doesn't mean that those aren't deflected or jammed, but they're not set blocks. And certainly, obviously, there's no kata for them, nor can there be. So it's not that certain arts are too primitive and not elegant or educated enough to have kata. It's just that there's no need for such a construct, such an approach, because it doesn't work for unarmed. It doesn't work for a confrontation, particularly one that's agreed, particularly one that's two things: agreed and reactive, not proactive.
So if we move away from teaching formal blocks, what do we replace them with, especially for beginners? In a sense, what would it take for mainstream karate to shift its view on blocking?
Well, they'd have to kind of rewrite it completely. About that, I think that's their business. I don't think that's our business. I think that the one of the main points of talking about blocking and the myth of blocking is that it's nothing to do with the antique kata. So, you don't have to look very far to realize that you can't, the blocking isn't an effective approach to fighting, armed or unarmed. Having that mindset where you can react, you think you could react quickly enough to deal with, being attacked or assaulted or whatever, or even if in some sort of match or whatever, duel or that. And so it's removing that idea from when you approach the antique kata. And that's the encouragement that we're trying to make here, is to not all the kata contain blocks and counters for unarmed combat. And once you remove the myth of blocking, what can you then do with the kata as well? It's a way of approaching the forms. If there's no blocking in them, what are they? What are those movements that you previously thought are blocks? What do they do? What could they do? And what can they do in the greater context of the whole form? Where do they fit in? And I think that's the important bit. I mean, from our perspective, how modern karate evolves is anyone's guess really, and up to the individual. But I think it's about being honest about it as well, which I think is really important. We talked about serious topics with knife crime and things like that. If you were telling people that they're going to have the opportunity to be able to block someone that's produced a knife or something like that, you're putting people in danger, you're putting them at risk. And so I think there's a responsibility there for people to, explore these things a bit further and adapt accordingly. But our adaptation is in how we approach the antique forms.
Yeah, I think just to lighten the note, well, there's a couple of points. I remember one very senior Japanese teacher being asked what to do if someone had a knife, and he gave an explanation and said you could do this, this, and this, and this, and then the guy asking the question said, "Well, what about if he's got a stick?" So the expert said, "Well, you can do that, and this." And then the chap said, "What if he's got a gun?" and the expert looked at him and said, "Run." Should have said run on the first question. I think that's just to try and lighten the subject a little bit. There's an issue that Goju-ryu as a group face, and that is how we could be seen as unpopular if we are going about the business of deconstructing a karate that so many people love, and we've loved it too. We've had to face some hard choices and take some very, very tough decisions over the years, as the reality of what the kata are and what they are not has unfolded. So we have had to face those certain realities. But one can understand why, why we might be seen as deconstructors or spoilers of everything. But all I can say about that is, don't shoot the messenger.
Yeah, indeed. Kev, what's your experience on all of this?
In the blocking thing,
Yeah,
it doesn't work. That's my experience. It doesn't work. I've seen it, and we've all had our things when we were younger, and no, it doesn't work. I mean, no one does a clean set piece when when there's an altercation. People don't do that, and I have. This is many years ago now. It was one Christmas walking back across the Guildhall in Portsmouth with someone from work, and there was a bunch of lads coming one way, and this bloke and his missus the other, and one of these blokes barged into on purpose, and this guy with his partner had a knife, a big thing about a foot long, and he pulled that out, and everyone ran. Everyone got out of the way. And no, everyone thought, nutter, out of the way. It's just, yeah. So I've seen that. I've seen that happen. So I don't think anyone's going to stand there and try and block a bloody knife. No, that's what I think. So,
And I think that the idea, well, not the idea, the fact that blocking doesn't work, I don't think that's news either. I think that the people that put together the antique forms, their martial skills and martial strategies into these kata, they knew that, and it's reflected in what is contained in those forms. But it was, the choreography is embraced on the stage, in the martial operas, in the stage performances, and it's when they've become confused, and it became confused in China. Just have a look at the build up to the Boxer Rebellion. Where the beliefs of what people were seeing on the stage has overflowed into, pretty grim reality, of coming up against guns. And the same thing is still happening today, because we have such amazing performances in movies. I mean, it's hard to watch the Wing Chun films, the Ip Man films, excuse me, and not look at that and go, wow, Wing Chun's amazing. Look at all those blocks, counters, traps, Donnie Yen does a remarkable job, and they're fantastic films. And you've got, great performers like Jackie Chan and Sammo Hung and all those guys who've created amazing choreography, and that kind of has leaked into the dojo as well. So modern dojos, modern kung fu and karate schools, there's an overflow from that choreography, and those beliefs kind of find their way in, and so the problem of blocking isn't new, and it's the same reasons it happened in history in China and Okinawa and all the rest of it are the same reasons it's happening now.
This Chinese theatre, every time you mention it, I just imagine this like Chinese WWE.
We're talking about people of the caliber like Jackie Chan's performances. We're talking about that caliber of performance on the stage, and it's a regular thing, and that's what people were seeing. And so when you see people perform like that, and they have unbelievable physical skills and can do all, amazing things, it's hard to not absorb something of that and it become part of your perspective or view of the world and things like. And it's not that difficult to convince people either. That's why it's so it becomes believable.
There's something else about this myth in that, the idea that it could be performed by anyone at any stage of their life, in any fitness, as well. And it sort of, because again, it's, as you say, it's theatrical, and it moves in that place where it's almost saying, well, you don't have to be really fit and strong and exercise, and push yourself physically and train physically, but actually you do. It's military training, isn't it? And it's funny as well that you in any other sport, in any other field, you'd retire by 30.
It's very unusual. Yeah, you'd be very unusual for anyone in their 50s to still be very competitive in boxing, or their 60s. It's just very unusual if someone's able to be competitive at that point.
But it perpetuates in the martial arts.
Karate, yeah, old master. The idea that they could somehow, you know. But that's choreography again, isn't it? Because in the movies, you have, if you think about Kill Bill, you've got Pai Mei, the old master, and he's still unbelievable. And but it's believable because it's so well done. But it's not true. It's not the reality.
Yeah.
Your reflexes do slow down. You won't be as quick. You won't be as it's getting old.
Your visual reflexes will, but your contact reflexes, they actually tend to remain. So if you take a pushing hands approach, although I'm not trying to go for the old master fantasy, but I think I could still achieve a reasonable standard of push hands, and I'm going towards, I'm heading for 70. So that's not too bad. Because I think if I put my hand on which I don't want to do, but on a hot plate by accident, I will remove it probably just as quickly as I would have done at 20.
Yeah.
But that's a different ball game altogether, because they're completely different. It's a different firing system. But that's another topic. But the touch reflexes, through contact training, allow you to pick up a force, determine its direction, and redirect it. Now that's a different approach and a different set of skills altogether. I'm not trying to claim self-defense capability through the back door, but those qualities can be demonstrated by older people, and not as limiting as the gymnastic sort of sporting capabilities, for instance, of a competition fighter. Not the same game at all. Completely different game. Yeah. Just while I raise the point of competition, just briefly in the side here, if you do look at karate tournaments, especially let's start with the full contact and then move back to semi-contact. If you look at full contact, and you've got you can see the bouts, they're all different kinds of associations, all over the globe. Hundreds and hundreds of them in America, for instance, in the United States. And you get different people from different styles or schools, and once they get in the ring or in the arena or wherever it is they're fighting, in the cage or whatever it is, whatever format, it's really difficult to tell one style from another. Which one is which? It's very, very difficult because they all trade blows in very, very similar ways. Let's move onwards now to semi-contact karate, and let's look at that. Then let's look at that within, for instance, the global Shotokan format. What one invariably sees then is a very big stress on a very quick reverse punch. It's probably the most used technique in those competitions, and it's absolutely the case that it is constantly a simultaneous exchange in which the referee or the referees, there's usually one on each corner, and they have to work out who landed first, or if anyone landed, because there's always lots of shouting and a quick withdrawal of the punching arm. And the other interesting point is that the competitors are dancing on the balls of their feet. They're not in any way using approaches that are tied back to either their basics or their kata in any meaningful way. In other words, they're using one of the third sets of types of karate that ostensibly meant to be one style of karate that we discussed in one of our earlier podcasts, that karate is not one thing but three. It's kata, the formal kata, the kumite, or the fixed kumite, the kion. Yes, these are fixed movements, and the sparring. And the three aren't the same. They use different body habits in entirely different ways, and yet they're amalgamated and said to be a style, but the three practices aren't related, which is why so many kumite champions really dislike kata. Now, there were exceptions to that. I can think of a few. I don't want to throw names around. There's one UK-based Shotokan champion, absolutely fabulous, who was both a kata champion and a kumite champion. There have been several of those, but they're the exception, not the rule. And lots of competitors in competitions would really love their competition and really train for that. And there's no evidence to indicate that kata training. There's no proper evidence to demonstrate that kata training improves the sparring, kumite, or one's capability in a competition or a tournament.
Yeah, quite. If you want to be good at sparring, do sparring.
Yeah, that's about it, isn't it, really? Watch the cage fights.
Where are all the moves from the antique forms in those fights? They're not there.
You never see it, do you?
No, and there's a nice range of different movements in the antique kata. I know we talk about the same kata, but take Sanseiru or Kusanku or Naihanchi, and you just don't see that material or emerging in MMA or anything like that. And even on footage of real fights, you just don't see it. So if that is evidence that it's not for that, if that's how you see it, I do. It leaves the question: what are these forms for? What were they for originally? The myth of blocking it's not something that was unknown to the Chinese creators of martial arts and things like that. It wasn't unknown to them. So that's the important thing, I think, is it ties right back to, well, what were these forms actually for? If they're not blocks, what is it? If it's not blocking, what is it?
Something I was thinking about the other day, something came up on the feed, and it was something like karate black belt wins UFC, and I watched it, and it was just, well, where's the kata? And just I was like, well, yeah, but he's doing MMA. Where's his? You can't. There's quite a lot of clickbait in that sense. There's a lot of.
And he's probably an exceptional fighter in spite of doing karate.
Yeah.
And you can't just, because somebody's done karate and won an MMA title, then put it down to the karate.
Yeah.
It's probably closest that they're an exceptional athlete, a natural born fighter anyway. And, I'm not saying that I'm sure that, there are thousands of capable fighters that do karate. Whether karate adds much to someone's fighting ability, I think that's a bigger question.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to what modern karate is, and we've covered that.
Yeah,
and
what does walking up and down doing oizuki or doing gohon kumite, where you do step back doing some blocks and then finish with what does that add to someone's fighting ability? Probably not a lot.
It's not related. It's not related to mixed martial arts at all. You might as well say, Joe Soap won the UFC. Joe Soap, the pastry chef, won. He's a pastry chef. He won the UFC. Yeah. What's It's got to do with UFC fighting. We know the answer to that. But the assumption is, because of the myth that is karate, the karateka should be able to lend a hand to all sorts of fighting, and it doesn't follow. Different skill sets altogether. I did write that a screw can be hammered in with a wrench, and with enough training, some people could get very good. You could imagine a person who had the screws in his teeth, several of them, and could just sort of spit one out, bang it in into a piece of wood, with a wrench, and do it, rapidly. So he's got 5 all banged it. Great, but a screw's not meant to be knocked in with anything. It's meant to be screwed in, and it's certainly not with a wrench. And a wrench is not really meant to be used for knocking in screws. It could use, let's use the correct tool for the correct purpose. While we're dispelling myths, I got a just final request to make. Could we please make sure we don't tackle the Tooth Fairy or Father Christmas? Don't want them debunked. Thank you. Don't want those debunked.
Thanks for tuning in. Today we peeled back the layers on the myth of blocking, examining its theatrical roots, its disconnect from real-world violence, and its absence in antique kata and modern combat alike. We challenged the assumptions built into traditional karate pedagogy and explored how movements often labelled as blocks might hold a deeper, more proactive purpose. If you're questioning what kata really contains, or how martial understanding evolves across history and context, we hope this gave you something to chew on. Don't forget to rate the show, follow for future episodes, and share it with your dojo or training partners. Got thoughts on blocking or a favourite banana attack defence story? Drop us a message, we'd love to hear it. Until next time, stay sharp, train smart.